Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. A question that I have often been asked, and even asked myself, and I'm sure many of you as well, is the question, why do bad things happen to good people? That's a question that has troubled and fascinated philosophers, sages, poets, saints, and even finds its way into the Bible, specifically in the book of Job. The book of Job is a fascinating book, and Job is a fascinating character. And let me give you the Cliff Note version, if I may. Job is a good and upright man. He is very well respected. He is very holy. He's very, very wealthy. And he is really a mover and shaker in the village in which he lives. And God takes great delight in Job. He has a beautiful family. He's wealthy. He has all of these things, and he is always thanking and praising God. Well, one day Satan appears before God, and God says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Oh, I've been roaming around the earth." And God says, "Well, have you taken notice of my good and faithful servant Job?" He said, "Yes, I've seen him." He said, "Yes, he's good and faithful for a very good reason." And God says, "And what might that be?" And Satan says, "Well, because you give him everything. You give him security. You protect him. You don't let any harm come to him. You give him a beautiful family. He's got riches. He's well respected. But I'll be willing to bet that if something bad happens to him, he'll end up cursing you." And God says, "My faithful Job would never do that." And Satan says, "Well, let me try." And God says, "Okay." So things begin to go badly for Job. He begins to lose some of his property. He begins to lose some of his animals. One of the worst things that happens to him is a storm develops, and members of his family are killed as the building collapses. And yet Job refuses to curse God, refuses to blame God. And God says to Satan, "See, Job remained faithful. I told you." And Satan says, "Well, of course. You know why? Because nothing has happened to Job personally. Oh, that was his things and his family. But Job is pretty well insulated and protected. But if something happens to him, I can assure you, he will curse you. Let me try." And God says, "Okay, but you can't bring any kind of death or physical injury to Job." And Satan says, "That's fine." So as the fortunes of Job keep going down and down and down, his so-called friends begin to turn on him. They become the great moralizers. "All right, Job, confess. What have you done to displease God? You must have done something wrong for all of these calamities to come your way. Your family, you're losing your property, friends have turned against you. God must be punishing you for something." And of course, Job protests his innocence. He's a good and upright man. He wants everyone to know that. And they say, no, you must be hiding something, because God's justice demands that if you in fact act wickedly on the earth, you will be punished on the earth. If you're good, you will be rewarded. And Job says, "No, I'm telling you, I'm still good and upright." And so he offers sacrifice again to God. Well, things go from bad to worse. And finally, a young boy, let's say a teenager or maybe a young adult, Elihu, comes by and tries to reason with and give answers and explanations to Job for his predicament. And he says, "Well, maybe God's letting this happen to you because he wants to teach you beforehand what happens when you sin. Maybe God is doing this in order to increase the strength of your character, to make you a better person. Maybe that's what's happening." Well, Job will have none of that. And so Job, at this point, is beginning to despair. In fact, he begins to say, God, it seems to me that you actually punish the innocent. The very question and intention of God is now called into play. Job is at the end of his rope. He's grief-stricken. He's now lost his friends, his status. He's lost his property. And there's no more sacrifices and no more nice God talk. He says, I demand to have a hearing before God. I want to ask God what's going on here. So God appears. God grants his request. And he says, Job, what's up? And Job says, well, I was about to ask you the same thing. What's up? What happened? What did I do? What's wrong? He begins to question God. And God says, Job, where were you when I was creating everything? Where were you when I brought the heavens and the earth, the animals and the field and the streams and the oceans, the stars and the planets? Where were you when I planted the gardens with all of the wonderful things that you have enjoyed? Where were you? I don't remember seeing you there. And then Job then begins to kind of retreat a little bit, because what God is saying is, look, Job, you can question me, but I'm not answerable to you. You're answerable to me. In other words, God is playing the God card. I'm more powerful than you. And so Job begins to back up a little bit. And then God shows a tremendous battle between two gigantic sea creatures, the behemoth and the leviathan. This tremendous battle takes place. And Job begins to realize his smallness and his weakness and his incapacity in the face of all of this. And he begins to step back from his accusations. He begins to realize perhaps this is the wrong tactic to take. And he takes back all of the accusations he has leveled against God, the main one being God is unjust. God is unfair. God giveth and God taketh away. And I'm not sure about praise the name of the Lord, because Job is doing pretty much anything but praising God's name at this point. So Job begins to kind of, as we say in Louisiana, he was beginning to crawfish a little bit. He was backing up. And finally, Job says that I realize that I was way out of line for all of the things that I said in my approach. And he begins to repent and to back up. And of course, the story ends with God restoring Job many times over, his family, his wealth, his status, his friends. The Lord who giveth and take away also returns more than he could ever have imagined before all of this took place. End of story. Now, to we moderns, that's a very unsatisfactory ending. We began to ask all kinds of questions. Well, why couldn't God have just done this in the beginning, and that made Job go through all of this kind of stuff? God does seem the heavy in this particular story. In fact, it seems that God is more interested in winning a bet with Satan than in teaching poor old Job anything. And so we have all of these kinds of questions that arise. Why bad things to good people? That's as troubling as the flip side of that coin, isn't it? Why do good things happen to bad people? That's a difficult question for them to answer. Difficult question for the believer. Why do bad things happen to good people? The difficult question for the bad people is why, when I am so bad and I recognize it and I know it, I can't hide it from myself. Certainly can't hide it from God. And yet God continues to allow me to have good things. I would suggest to you that all of this is very unsatisfactory. You can read your books in philosophy, you can read your books in literature, you can read your books in theology. You can do all of that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, we come away with the idea that all of these things that I read are rather unsatisfactory. Why do bad things happen to good people? And why do good things happen to bad people? Well, I think it's because we're asking the wrong question. And when you ask the wrong question, you often get wrong answers. Any good philosopher, like Socrates, and any good lawyer will tell you the question is the most important thing. And always know the answer before you ask the question. So the question that I would suggest we ask is this one. What do good people do when bad things happen? See, because we can spend a lifetime going back and forth in theory, in speculation, on the idea of why bad things happen to good people, the why question. There are as many answers as there are people. But what do good people do when bad things happen? The emphasis is now shifted to us. How do we respond when bad things happen to us? And most of us live good lives as it goes. We try to raise our families. We try to live responsibly. We're good citizens. We try to help our neighbor. In other words, most of us try to live like decent folk. That's what we try to do. And we ask ourselves, why are all these bad things happening to me? I go to church. I put my children through Catholic school. I've done all of that kind of stuff. I've been faithful in my marriage. And look what's happened to me. Well, we've all had those moments of frustration. And we tend to kind of pass over them and let them fade away. But those are the kind of questions that don't go away. But what do? Well, in the contemporary lingo, the answer is we keep on keeping on. We don't become bitter. We don't become angry, resentful. We don't become closed in on ourselves. We don't all of a sudden abandon living a decent life. Because you see, it is in the struggle that the strength comes. There is no strength without struggle. I think all of us would agree with that. Those of you that have had a hip replacement or a knee replacement, the most difficult thing very often is not the operation, it's the physical therapy that follows. The first couple of days you think you're dying, or at least you wish you were dying. And yet you know if you don't go through that struggle, the operation was for naught. In fact, you may actually be worse than before you had the operation, because now you may be paralyzed or do further damage to your joints. It is in the struggle. It is in the struggle of facing the bad things that happen even when we're trying to live good, even holy lives. But it happens. Life happens. And that's a difficult question for us. And I think it's a difficult question for this reason as well. The great philosopher of the 20th century, a Catholic existential French philosopher, Gabriel Marcel, he said there's two ways to approach life. Life is a problem to be solved or a mystery to be drawn into. We like the problem to be solved. Why? Because we have an answer. You may be sitting here right now saying, well, you know, he hasn't told me an answer yet. He hasn't given me the answer. Here I am looking at this video, and I don't see an answer on the horizon. And you're quite correct. Very perceptive. Because I can't give you the answer. The Bible didn't give you the answer. The great philosophers didn't give you the answer. It's a mystery to be drawn into. And what I mean by that is that each and every one of us, in our own daily experience, our reflection our prayer, our contemplation. We come to an understanding ourselves. We come to a maturity of our mind and our heart and our soul, and it comes with that. Don't be so quick to dismiss the mystery of bad things to good people. We have to stay with it a while and see, what is it telling us? What does it tell us about ourselves? What does it tell us about others? Do we have sunshine friends? Blue skies, green light, they're there. But as soon as the clouds form and the rain starts and the thunder and the lightning take place, we're all alone. That was Job. How do we react to the bad things that happen to us? We may have come right out of church and we find out we have a ticket on our car or the tire is flat. Well, no use going to church. That really helped me. Well, we can do that. But it's, what do we do? How do we react? What do good people do when bad things happen? They continue their commitments. They continue their vows. They continue to live a decent life. It's a very difficult thing. It's easy to become bitter and resentful, disillusioned. But that's where I think God's grace comes in, because it comes down to our openness to grace, our openness to that power beyond ourselves. Because if we're just dependent upon ourselves to get through things, it's going to be pretty rough going, frankly. And so what we have to do is also to surrender to these things and not necessarily always push against the wind and the waves. Sometimes it only makes it worse. Sometimes resistance is not the best. Sometimes it is that mature surrender and going with the flow till we reach that peaceful port, those settled waters. That will happen, but it also takes patience. But above all, we're not going to find the answer outside of ourselves and our relationship with God. Jesus Christ was the totally innocent one. And he took upon himself the sins of the world, all of our guilt, all of our wrong, and all that ever was and ever will be. And he took it to the cross. He never stopped being who he was. Oh, he said, let the cup pass. I don't want this. I don't want any part of this. And Jesus was sent an angel from the Father to strengthen him. And Jesus says, if this cup cannot pass, let your will be done, not mine. See, when you talk about surrender, there's two ways to surrender, isn't there? One way is this way. Okay, don't shoot. I give up. And there's another way to surrender. God, fill me with your grace. God, give me the strength through the storm of life and help me to keep on keeping on. Both are surrenders. One is the surrender of defeat, and one is the surrender of victory, when we are strong enough to recognize our weakness. It's a very paradoxical thing, but it is in our weakness that we are truly strong when we look to Almighty God. And of course, the help of others around us, good friends, faithful friends. And so each and every day we live this mystery, the mystery of life. Is there anything more mysterious than life? When we get up in the morning, we can have the day planned. Everything, we have it to the minute. And something comes up and messes up the whole schedule. So much for plan. You know, man proposes and God disposes. Well, that happens. How do we respond? Well, we become creative, adaptive. Or do we sit in the office and pout and yell at everybody and make everybody stay miserable? It's what we do. So when bad things happen to us, we can try and solve it as a problem. Very frustrating, It can go on, it will go on for a lifetime. And at the end, we won't find the answer. Or we can be drawn into the mystery of living. The mystery of living this life that God has given to us. Because you see, life is the great adventure.